The morning had begun with the kind of brightness that belongs only to wedding days. The air in the town felt expectant, like every leaf on every tree knew what was about to unfold. A young woman named Clara was at the center of it all, her life about to pivot into what should have been its most radiant chapter. Neighbors spoke of her as a gentle soul, a girl who had grown into grace without losing the softness of childhood. She was meant to walk down the aisle that afternoon, her name to be spoken in vows, her future sealed with joy. Yet even as the bells waited to toll, something invisible was already unraveling in the silence between those hours. It is here the story begins, not with a celebration, but with an absence. At the very moment when family and friends were adjusting corsages and straightening chairs, Clara slipped from the tapestry of their lives. No warning, no scream, no goodbye. Just the sudden, inexplicable absence of a bride who was supposed to arrive at the church but never did. The lace of her veil would never catch the sunlight. The bouquet meant for her hands would never feel her touch. Instead, the town was left with questions that would echo across decades. People remember that morning in fragments. A bridesmaid said Clara laughed nervously as they fastened the final button of her gown. Her mother claimed she kissed her cheek and whispered that everything would be all right, though she did not say what needed reassuring. The groom recalled the last call they shared, a brief conversation filled with excitement, but with an undertone he could not explain. These memories, so ordinary in the moment, took on new weight when she vanished. Each recalled word became a clue, each gesture a possible sign. The setting itself felt almost cruel in its beauty. The church was decorated in soft pastels, ribbons tied to pews, flowers cut fresh that morning. Guests arrived in pressed clothes, smiles warming their faces. No one could have imagined that instead of a procession, they would sit in confusion, whispers replacing hymns. Hours passed. Someone checked the road for the car that never appeared. Another dialed the phone repeatedly, hearing only silence on the other end. The absence grew heavier, spreading through the air until it felt as if the entire town was holding its breath. What makes this disappearance so haunting is not just that it was unexpected, but that it occurred on a day defined by certainty. A wedding is meant to be the promise of stability, of future, of continuity. When Clara vanished, it felt to those who loved her as if the ground beneath their feet had been stolen. The suddenness created an emotional fracture. Parents found themselves unable to reconcile joy with fear. The groom's family stood helpless, caught between rage and disbelief. The community, too, was unsettled, as if an invisible crack had opened in the familiar landscape of their town. Years later, people would describe that day in tones usually reserved for disasters, though no storm had come and no fire had burned. It was a disaster of silence, of emptiness. The horror was not in what was seen, but in what could not be found. No one walking past the church that afternoon would have guessed a tragedy was unfolding inside. The bells remained silent, the doors stayed open, the decorations sagged as time moved forward, but Clara did not. This opening moment is not just an incident in history, but the seed of a mystery that would stretch over decades. Clara's disappearance became more than a missing persons case. It became a story people carried in their hearts, told in whispers at dinner tables, repeated to newcomers in town as both cautionary tale and unsolvable riddle. For those closest to her, the absence was never abstract. It was daily, personal, and cruel. Every birthday left uncelebrated, every holiday missing her laugh, every empty chair at family gatherings deepened the wound. To begin here, in the fragile light of that morning, is to begin with contrast, hope and despair colliding in a single breath. The story of Clara is not only about a young woman who vanished, but about how lives fracture when certainty is stolen. It is about the questions that burrow into silence, about the human need for closure, and about the haunting that occurs when the truth stays just out of reach. On that morning in 1993, as the sunlight glimmered on lace and ribbons, no one imagined that they were witnessing not the start of a marriage, but the beginning of a ghost story that would linger for generations. The church sat like a solemn witness at the heart of the town, its whitewashed walls and stained glass windows prepared for a ceremony that would never begin. People had arrived with bouquets in hand, wearing their best clothes, their voices carrying that particular mixture of anticipation and warmth that comes only on wedding days. The pews filled with neighbors, relatives, childhood friends, all of them waiting for the moment when the bride would appear at the doorway and the music would rise. Yet as the clock hands moved forward and the doorway remained empty, the sound inside the church began to change. Anticipation curdled into murmurs, smiles softened into frowns, and a weight settled on the air as though even the rafters had begun to sag with worry. Whispers traveled faster than hymns. First, someone suggested she might be delayed, a hairpin misplaced, a last-minute photograph. 10 minutes became 30. 30 became an hour. Guests began to look at one another rather than at the altar. Children grew restless, tugging at sleeves, while parents hushed them with distracted voices. The groom stood at the front, his hands trembling slightly though he tried to mask it with composure. Behind him, his best man shifted uncomfortably, caught between wanting to reassure and fearing the words would sound false. In a town this small, unease spreads quickly. Everyone knew everyone, and the absence of one young woman felt as though the community's own heart had skipped a beat. Outside, the town itself seemed to hold still. Cars slowed as drivers noticed the restless gathering spilling onto the church steps. Passers-by exchanged puzzled glances. For decades, this church had hosted weddings that ended with laughter, photographs, and music drifting into the night. To see it now, stalled in silence, felt like a violation of tradition, almost sacrilegious. Some guests ventured into the yard to smoke, their faces pale as if afraid of saying aloud the thought pressing into their minds, something was not right. By the second hour, rumors began to thread their way between the pews. Had Clara fallen ill? Had she changed her mind? Had some accident occurred on the road to the church? Each theory was spoken in hushed tones, as though uttering them too loudly would make them real. The bride's family avoided eye contact, pacing in quiet corners, their movements frantic but restrained by the weight of watchful eyes. Her mother clutched a lace handkerchief so tightly that the threads left imprints on her palm. Her father's jaw remained locked, his silence louder than words. Grief had not yet arrived, but dread had settled in. What made the moment unbearable was the collision between ceremony and crisis. The ribbons still swayed on the pews, the flowers still perfumed the air, but those signs of joy mocked the fear growing heavier with each passing minute. Guests tried to smile politely, tried to believe the explanations they whispered to one another, yet beneath it all was the truth they could not admit: brides do not vanish. Not here. Not today. Not like this. Eventually, the groom stepped down from the altar and retreated into a side room, his face pale, his expression unreadable. The organist closed the instrument, the silence ringing louder than music. Children were ushered outside to spare them from overhearing the adults' increasingly desperate conversations. Someone suggested calling the police, though others resisted, clinging to the hope that she might walk through the doors at any moment, laughing off the delay as some silly mistake. But as the sun shifted across the windows and the light inside the church grew dimmer, denial grew harder to hold. By late afternoon, the whispers had transformed into a kind of collective paralysis. People did not know whether to leave or stay, whether to comfort the family or give them space. The celebration had decayed into confusion, then fear, then silence. That silence was the most unsettling thing of all. A wedding is meant to be filled with sound, vows, songs, laughter, applause. Instead, the only sound was the scraping of chairs as guests shifted uncomfortably, and the hollow echo of footsteps across the stone floor. In a town where lives were woven tightly together, suspicion began to take root almost instantly. People cast sideways glances at one another, not openly accusing but quietly wondering, who had seen Clara last? Who had spoken to her that morning? Had anyone noticed something strange? In such a small place, gossip could travel faster than fact, and soon the disappearance became not only a tragedy but a test of loyalty. Every family felt the tremor of it, every household carrying away a different version of the story that would be retold for years. The church eventually emptied, but the sense of unease clung to its walls. Bouquets drooped in their vases, ribbons fluttered in the evening breeze, and the aisle remained untouched, waiting for footsteps that never came. Guests went home, but they did not rest. They replayed the day in their minds, searching for details, for clues, for anything that might explain how a bride could vanish in plain sight. The town, once animated by joy, had fallen into a hush that would not lift for decades. It was as though the disappearance had stolen not only Clara, but the innocence of a place that had believed such things could never happen there. That night, long after the church was locked and the flowers began to wilt, the community lay awake in their homes, staring into the dark. The empty bed where a new husband should have lain beside his wife remained untouched. Parents sat in silence, unable to speak, unable to breathe without the weight of loss pressing down on their chests. And all across town, behind curtains and closed doors, the same thought haunted them: if a bride could disappear on her wedding day, then perhaps no one was truly safe from vanishing. The town that once celebrated together now shared something darker, a collective silence, a wound without words. And in that silence, Clara's absence grew into something larger than any one family's grief. It became a shadow over the whole community, a reminder of how fragile the line is between ordinary life and the mysteries that can steal it away. She was last seen not in a dark alley or an unfamiliar road, but in the kind of quiet, private moments that should have been ordinary, forgettable, and safe. That is what makes Clara's final hours so piercing to remember. They were filled with gestures so small, so fragile, that no one realized they might be the last fragments of her presence. What remained after she vanished were not clear answers, but a mosaic of memories, bits and pieces carried by those who loved her, each one offering a glimpse but never the whole. These fragments became the only way to hold on to her, and, at the same time, the only reminders of how suddenly she had slipped away. One bridesmaid would later describe how Clara had laughed nervously that morning, fiddling with the lace of her gown as though it were too delicate to belong to her. She looked beautiful, the bridesmaid whispered, her voice trembling even decades later, but she kept glancing at the mirror as if she was searching for something behind her reflection. That moment, at the time, had felt harmless, anxious excitement, perhaps the natural jitters of a bride. But in hindsight, it became charged with mystery. Was Clara only nervous about her vows, or was something else weighing on her heart? Her mother remembered leaning in to fasten the final pearl button at the back of her dress. The scent of perfume lingered in the room, mixing with the faint aroma of roses from the bouquet that rested on a table nearby. She kissed me on the cheek, her mother recalled, and whispered, "Everything will be all right." At the time, it seemed like reassurance for a worried mother. But later, those words twisted into an enigma. Why did Clara feel the need to promise that things would be all right? What did she know that her family did not? Her fiancé, now older, weathered by time, would speak of their last phone call. His voice cracked as he remembered the sound of her laughter, soft and distant, and then a pause on the line. She sounded happy, he said, but there was this hesitation. Like she wanted to tell me something but couldn't. He had brushed it off as nerves, but in the years that followed, that hesitation would haunt him. Did she want to confess a fear? Did she want to say goodbye? He replayed that call countless times in his mind, searching for hidden meanings in every breath, every silence. Even the smallest details became magnified by absence. A cousin recalled how Clara had stood by a window, looking out at the sunlight as if memorizing it. A neighbor swore she saw Clara walking in the garden early that morning, barefoot in the dew, her dress hem lifted slightly, her face unreadable. Another bridesmaid said Clara was humming a tune she didn't recognize, repeating the same few notes again and again as if they were carrying her somewhere far away. Each memory is intimate, yet none explain what happened. Instead, they deepen the mystery, painting a portrait of a woman both present and already slipping out of reach. What these fragments reveal most is how disappearance reshapes memory. Every smile, every pause, every fleeting glance becomes loaded with significance, whether it deserves it or not. Those who knew her began to question themselves. Had they missed a signal? Had they failed to notice the storm beneath her calm exterior? Guilt braided itself with grief, until even love felt like accusation. Her bridesmaids, her family, her fiancé, all carried the burden of wondering if they had overlooked the one clue that could have saved her. The wedding preparations themselves became artifacts of loss. The veil left draped across a chair, the bouquet that never left its vase, the handwritten vows folded neatly in her purse. Objects that should have belonged to the happiest day of her life became relics of her absence, fragile testimonies that she had been there, alive and ready, until she was not. Each item seemed to whisper of what should have happened, what might have happened, and what never would. And so, Clara's final hours were not a dramatic sequence of events, but a scattering of intimate, unfinished moments. They carried the quiet tenderness of a daughter kissing her mother's cheek, the excitement of a bride laughing with her friends, the hesitation of a young woman holding something unspoken on her lips. Together, they form a collage that is beautiful and devastating, a reminder that the last traces of a life are often ordinary until absence gives them extraordinary weight. To reconstruct those hours is to stand inside a room filled with echoes, laughter that cuts short, words that dangle unfinished, glances that refuse to explain themselves. It is to feel her presence so vividly that her absence becomes unbearable. And it is to understand that sometimes, the most haunting mysteries are not written in the dramatic gestures of crime or accident, but in the tender spaces between people, spaces where love, fear, and silence meet, and where a single missing step can unravel an entire life. The search began almost instantly, as though the town itself had leapt to its feet the moment it realized something was wrong. At first it was chaos dressed up as urgency, neighbors rushing to their cars, officers radioing in hurried descriptions, volunteers spreading across streets and fields. But as the day turned into night, and night stretched into morning, a strange stillness descended. The initial burst of movement had yielded nothing. Not a dropped shoe on the roadside, not a trail of fabric caught on a fence, not a single witness who could say where Clara had gone. It was as if the earth had swallowed her whole. The police worked through the usual steps. Roadblocks were set up at the edges of town. Officers combed through fields with flashlights, beams cutting across the tall grass in narrow arcs. Dogs were brought in, sniffing for traces, their handlers growing frustrated when the scents dissolved into nothing. The river was dragged, men in boots standing knee-deep in cold water, pulling at weeds and stones that revealed no body, no clue. Each effort ended in silence, the kind that eats away at determination until it feels like futility. Reporters arrived, their vans parked along the main road, their cameras pointed at a community that looked both protective and ashamed. Interviews captured trembling voices, tearful faces. Neighbors spoke of Clara as though describing a ghost, kind, shy, beloved, and yet none could explain her vanishing. Some said she must have run, others whispered of darker possibilities. The police tried to keep control, but the absence of evidence opened a door for speculation that no official statement could close. The fiancé was questioned first, as tradition and suspicion demand. He sat in a small, overheated room at the station, answering questions about their relationship, their last conversations, her state of mind. He swore he had no idea where she had gone. He swore she had seemed happy. Detectives leaned forward, searching his eyes for cracks, for hesitation. They found only exhaustion, grief, and the stubborn silence of a man whose life had been undone in a single day. He was released, but suspicion lingered in the whispers of the town. Attention turned to the family. Had Clara confided in them? Had she mentioned doubts? Her parents insisted she was excited for the wedding, nervous in the way any young bride might be, but nothing more. The police scoured her bedroom, flipping through photo albums, sifting through drawers, even unfolding the notes she had passed in high school classes years before. They were looking for anything, a pattern, a clue, a sign. What they found was the ordinary clutter of a young woman's life: trinkets, diaries too old to matter, pressed flowers, photographs of summer afternoons. None of it explained why she had disappeared. Days became weeks, and the investigation began to slow. Without evidence, theories became increasingly desperate. Some suggested she had fled the town entirely, slipping away to start a new life. Others insisted she had been abducted, though no one could say by whom. A few whispered the word murder, but without a body, even that remained speculation. The police held meetings, released statements, but beneath the formality was the quiet confession of helplessness. The longer the trail grew cold, the more the case turned into a scar for the town itself. Streets where officers once marched with determination now lay quiet. Posters with Clara's photograph, bright at first, began to fade in the sun, their corners curling, their staples rusting. Families who had once gathered at the church to pray for her safe return grew weary, their voices hoarse from unanswered pleas. Hope lingered, but it felt thin, fragile, as if one strong wind might blow it away. What made the absence unbearable was how ordinary life refused to stop. Weddings still took place at the same church. Children still laughed in the same streets. Neighbors still mowed their lawns and swept their porches. But beneath the surface, nothing was the same. Every celebration carried a shadow. Every gathering seemed haunted by the question that no one could answer. Even years later, when people spoke of that summer, their voices lowered, their sentences ending not in periods but in silence. For Clara's family, the investigation's failure was a wound that never closed. Her mother refused to pack away the photographs in the living room, keeping them as though Clara might walk back through the door at any moment. Her father grew quieter, his presence marked by long silences at the dinner table, the clinking of cutlery against plates that seemed too loud. For the groom, the unanswered questions became a prison. He was not only a man who had lost his bride, he was the man who had stood at the altar as she vanished, forever linked to a mystery he could not explain. The cold trail of 1993 was not just a failure of evidence, but a failure of time. Every day that passed without an answer deepened the gap between Clara and those who longed for her. It was not just that she had disappeared, but that the disappearance itself had no shape, no edges, no clear story to hold on to. The unknown became its own kind of torment, sharper than grief because it offered no closure. And so the town carried her absence like an open wound, a reminder that sometimes the world does not provide answers, no matter how desperately they are sought. In the end, the investigation became not a narrative of discovery, but a chronicle of silence. Files were boxed, evidence logged, interviews transcribed, but all of it amounted to nothing more than the outline of a story with its center missing. Clara's name remained on the lips of the community, but her trail dissolved into the air. It was this silence, more than anything, that left the deepest scar, the realization that sometimes people vanish, and no amount of searching, no flood of prayers, no weight of law can bring them back. It was nearly 3 decades later when the house on Willow Street was finally unlocked for the last time. The walls had grown tired, the paint faded into shades of memory, the garden overtaken by weeds that had crept quietly while the world outside moved on. Clara's parents were gone now, their absence a second grief layered on top of the first, and the home that had once echoed with laughter and arguments and piano music was to be emptied, its belongings sorted into boxes marked for charity, for keepsakes, for disposal. Families leave behind objects the way trees drop leaves, in piles, scattered, fragile, carrying whispers of seasons long past. It was her brother who climbed into the attic first. The ladder creaked beneath his weight, dust rising into the shaft of sunlight that cut through the small circular window. The air was heavy, still holding the scent of cedar and mothballs. There is a peculiar hush in attics, as though time itself gathers there, layering memories in dust. He swept his hand across a stack of yellowed newspapers, pushing them aside, when his fingers touched a box hidden beneath an old quilt. The cardboard was soft from age, the edges frayed, the tape brittle. It had been there for decades, untouched, waiting. Inside were things that seemed ordinary, yet carried the intimacy of someone's private world. A handful of pressed flowers, their petals fragile as paper. A stack of letters tied with string, the ink faded, the handwriting familiar. Photographs curled at the edges, their colors blurred with age. And beneath it all, wrapped in a piece of linen, was a small book, leather cracked, pages browned, the kind of diary a young girl might clutch to her chest at night. It was Clara's. For a moment, he did not move. The diary was heavy, not in weight but in significance, like a relic from a life that had been frozen on the day she disappeared. The house had been emptied of her for years, yet here she was again, her voice pressed between pages, her presence preserved in ink. He carried it downstairs, his hands trembling slightly, as though afraid that opening it would be both discovery and betrayal. The family gathered around the kitchen table, the same table where Clara once did her homework, where birthday candles had been blown out, where laughter had been shared in better years. The diary sat in the middle, small and unassuming, yet radiating a kind of power. To open it was to break a silence that had lasted for 30 years. To open it was to invite Clara back into the room, to let her speak again. When the first page was turned, the handwriting was uneven, childish loops and slants. Dear Diary, it began, the kind of opening countless children had written. The earliest entries were filled with innocent details, a new dress she liked, a game she played in the yard, the way her mother's cookies smelled when she came home from school. It was the ordinary joy of a girl who had no idea her life would one day become a story retold in whispers. But as the pages turned, innocence gave way to adolescence. Her words became sharper, more confessional, her voice emerging more clearly. She wrote of crushes, of arguments with her parents, of dreams she couldn't quite name. She pressed flowers between the pages, small violets and daisies, as though trying to trap moments of beauty before they faded. There were doodles in the margins, hearts, arrows, half-finished sketches of faces. And then, slowly, the tone began to change. Hidden among the light-hearted entries were shadows. Phrases that stood out, cryptic in their brevity. Sometimes I feel like someone is watching me. I don't know if I'll ever be free. I wish I could tell someone, but I'm afraid they won't understand. These lines, written in the hand of a teenager, carried the weight of something unspoken. They were not explanations, not accusations, but fragments of a deeper fear that she had never shared aloud. Finding the diary was like discovering a new version of Clara, one who had been speaking all along but whose words had gone unheard. It reframed everything that had come before. Her disappearance was no longer just a moment of vanishing. It was part of a story that had begun years earlier, one that might have been visible had anyone known to look. In that kitchen, the family turned the pages slowly, reverently, as though the diary might disintegrate if handled too roughly. Each entry was read with both awe and sorrow, awe that her voice had survived, sorrow that it was trapped on paper rather than alive in the room. They were listening to a ghost, and the ghost was their daughter, their sister, their bride who had never made it to the altar. The attic had kept its secret for 30 years, dust and wood beams sheltering Clara's voice. Now, with the box open and the diary unfolded, the silence of the past began to stir. Her words, faint but steady, invited them to reconsider everything they thought they knew about the girl who had vanished. The diary was not just a relic, it was a mirror, reflecting back a version of Clara that was both familiar and entirely new. And as they read, one thought pressed in, undeniable and chilling. Perhaps the answers had been here all along, waiting above their heads in the stillness of an attic that no one had dared to disturb. The diary was not read in a single sitting. It was too heavy for that, too intimate, as though each page demanded its own silence afterward. To hold it was to feel Clara's pulse beneath the paper, the careful strokes of her handwriting carrying the rhythm of a young woman's inner life. At first, it was charming in its simplicity. Entries about favorite songs, about school dances where she stood along the edge of the gym, about the thrill of catching someone's glance across a classroom. But slowly, inevitably, the words deepened, and what began as a girl's innocent journal turned into something darker, layered, and urgent. The earliest chapters were harmlessly tender. "Today I wore the blue dress," she wrote in one entry, "and I felt pretty, even though no one noticed." In another, she described how she practiced writing her name beside the name of a boy she liked, filling the margins with looping signatures of a life she could only imagine. She wrote of the house she grew up in, how the floorboards creaked at night, how her father's voice carried through the walls, how her mother's lullabies once made her feel safe. These lines painted a portrait of a child growing into herself, a voice echoing with longing and discovery. But after 100 or so pages, the tone began to shift. The handwriting grew sharper, the ink pressed harder into the paper, as though she was trying to carve her words into permanence. She confessed that sometimes she felt like she was living two lives, the cheerful one that people expected, and the shadowed one she carried inside. "Everyone thinks I'm happy," she wrote. "But I don't think they'd recognize me if they knew the truth. Sometimes I feel like I'm just pretending to be the girl they want me to be." There were cryptic mentions of someone, never named, but always there, hovering between the lines. "He makes me nervous, but I can't say why." Another entry, "I wish I could stop seeing him in places he shouldn't be. Maybe it's in my head. Maybe not." At the time, she was still a teenager, and the words could be read in many ways: paranoia, infatuation, or something more sinister. Without context, the diary gave no certainty, only shadows that refused to form into shapes. Still, there was also beauty in her voice. Clara dreamed of traveling, of living by the sea, of writing her own book one day. She doodled waves in the margins, drew tiny boats with sails unfurled. She wrote about how she longed to escape the gravity of her small town, how she felt as though every street, every face, every expectation pinned her in place. "I don't want to be trapped," she confessed. "Not here, not anywhere. If I stay, I'll disappear inside myself." The irony of those words, discovered decades after her literal disappearance, was unbearable. As the pages turned toward her young adulthood, her entries became more fragmented, almost as if she could not decide whether to confess or to conceal. "I wish I could tell someone what I'm afraid of. What would happen if I just ran? Sometimes I feel like the wedding is the end of me, not the beginning." These fragments were raw and unfinished, written in haste, as if she had scrawled them quickly before losing her nerve. And then there were the cryptic notes, scattered like riddles. "The shadows won't let me go. There's a secret I'm carrying, and I don't know if I can survive it. If anyone reads this, maybe they'll finally understand." They were lines that read like the edges of a confession, as though Clara was circling something she could not quite say aloud. Each sentence begged for context, but offered none. It was not a confession, not an explanation, only a chorus of half-revealed fears that unsettled more than they clarified. Reading it, her family felt the sting of guilt. Had Clara been speaking all along, in ways they hadn't understood? Had she left clues in her laughter, in her silences, in the way her eyes sometimes seemed distant even in the middle of a conversation? It was as though the diary was accusing them not directly, but by existing, proof that she had been carrying something too heavy for her shoulders, and no one had noticed. For the fiancé, the entries were unbearable. He read them slowly, his thumb tracing over the ink, pausing at every hesitation, every cryptic line. "I don't want to be trapped. The wedding feels like an ending." He closed the book more than once, unable to continue, as though the words themselves might undo him. Was she writing about him? Was the wedding itself what she feared? Or was he misinterpreting, forcing his own grief onto words that might have meant something entirely different? The diary became not only a record of Clara's voice, but a prism through which everyone projected their own regrets, their own suspicions, their own fears. Each reader found something different in it, as if her words had been written for them alone, tailored to pierce their particular guilt. It was no longer just Clara's story, it was theirs, refracted through the ink of a young woman who had vanished before anyone could ask her what she truly meant. And yet, for all its shadows, the diary carried moments of piercing tenderness. A line about how she loved the sound of rain on the attic roof. A sketch of a seashell beside a note that read, "One day I'll find a place where I belong." A description of a dream where she walked barefoot into the ocean and felt finally, blissfully free. These glimpses of her inner life reminded them of the person she was, vivid, yearning, alive, even as her absence pressed heavier with every page. When the last entry was read, the silence that followed was suffocating. The room felt different, as though Clara herself had brushed past them, leaving the faintest trace of her presence. The diary had not solved the mystery, it had deepened it. It had not explained her disappearance, it had complicated it. What it offered was not clarity, but intimacy, an unfiltered voice from the past, speaking truths too tangled to decode. And in that intimacy lay the cruelest truth of all. Clara had been speaking all along, but no one had truly listened until it was too late. He had lived for 30 years with the word almost pressed into his chest like a stone he could never remove. Almost married. Almost a husband. Almost the one who might have saved her. In the quiet corners of his life, when the noise of the world retreated and he was left alone with his memories, it was almost that haunted him most. Michael was his name, though most still thought of him only in relation to Clara, her fiancé, her intended, the man who had waited at the altar for a bride who never appeared. He was in his early 20s in 1993, young and earnest, carrying the kind of hope that seems invincible until life teaches otherwise. By every account, he adored her. He brought her flowers he could scarcely afford, left notes in her mailbox when words felt too urgent to wait until morning, built a life in his imagination where their names would one day be etched on the same mailbox, on the same bank account, on the same gravestone. But to speak of him now, decades later, was to speak of a man with two lives, the one before Clara vanished, and the one after. The first was defined by light, college days, long drives with the windows down, the thrill of engagement. The second was defined by shadows, his name forever tethered to an absence he could not explain, a disappearance that some whispered might have been his fault. When the diary resurfaced, it cut him open in ways he had not expected. At first, when Clara's brother placed the cracked leather book into his hands, he resisted. He did not want to read it. For years, he had avoided photographs, avoided old letters, avoided the places they used to go. To see her handwriting again was like hearing her voice. But the weight of the diary was irresistible, he had to know. The entries began tender, almost sweet, the voice of the girl he remembered. She described the way he made her laugh, the small ways he showed up for her, the way she sometimes dreamed of their wedding with the kind of anticipation that only the very young can feel. For Michael, these passages were both balm and blade. They reminded him of the love he believed they shared, the future they had been planning. For a moment, he could almost believe she had loved him as completely as he had loved her. But then came the darker lines. The wedding feels like the end, not the beginning. Sometimes I wonder if love is another kind of trap. I wish I could run, but I don't know where I would go. Each sentence stabbed at him. Was she writing about him? Was he the trap she feared? Or were these words the shadows of something else, something she hadn't dared to name? Michael carried those questions like wounds. For decades, he had defended her memory, swearing she would never have left willingly, insisting that something terrible had been done to her. Yet here, in her own handwriting, was evidence that she had been afraid of something, and he could not untangle whether that something was him. The community, back then, had not been kind. On the day she vanished, suspicion turned quickly toward the groom. In small towns, rumors moved faster than facts, and the fact was simple. Clara had disappeared on the very day she was to marry Michael. To many, that could only mean one of two things: she had run from him, or he had silenced her before she could. Neither rumor left him whole. The police questioned him, neighbors watched him, and whispers followed him into the grocery store, into the gas station, into church pews. He swore he had nothing to do with it, and there was no evidence to contradict him. But the absence of evidence is not the same as innocence in the court of public opinion. Over the years, Michael's life unraveled quietly. He worked odd jobs, drifted from town to town, unable to settle in places where the story of Clara was still remembered. He never remarried. He never proposed again. Friends drifted away, uncomfortable with his grief, his persistence, his refusal to move on. He lived in the shadow of a single day in 1993, the day he stood at the altar with his heart in his throat, waiting for footsteps that never came. When the diary surfaced, some saw it as vindication. Perhaps Clara had been troubled, perhaps she had run, perhaps her disappearance had nothing to do with him at all. Others saw it as evidence of something darker, that she had feared her wedding, feared her future, feared the man waiting for her in a rented tuxedo. For Michael, it was both relief and accusation, both solace and torment. He sat alone with the diary one evening, the house silent around him, a lamp casting long shadows across the page. He read her words slowly, aloud, as though speaking them might conjure her back. Sometimes I feel like I'm just pretending to be the girl they want me to be. His voice cracked on the line. Which they did she mean? Her parents? Him? The town? Or someone else entirely? Michael had lived with 30 years of silence. Now, Clara's words broke that silence, but not in the way he had hoped. They did not free him. They bound him tighter. For every line that spoke of love, another hinted at fear. For every dream she confessed, another suggested dread. She was both the girl who kissed him by the lake and the woman who wrote that she longed to escape. He could not reconcile those two Claras, and so he was left with both, the memory of a fiancé who loved him and the mystery of a bride who might have feared him. To this day, he remains a figure both tragic and ambiguous. To some, he is the unlucky groom, a man forever chained to grief he did not deserve. To others, he is the shadow at the edge of Clara's diary, the unnamed figure she circled in her words but never named. In truth, he may be both. Or neither. What is certain is this: the man she almost married is still living with the silence of her absence, still haunted by the possibility that the diary was her way of speaking to him across decades, not to accuse, not to absolve, but simply to remind him that she was more complicated than the girl in the white dress everyone remembers. And for Michael, that is the hardest truth of all. Clara was not a symbol, not a mystery, not a ghost. She was a woman, layered and alive, whose voice survived only in the pages of a diary he can never stop reading. The past has a strange way of resurfacing, not always in neat revelations, but in fragments, in whispers, in things misplaced and then discovered when no one is looking. By the time the diary had been read and reread, the family thought they had unearthed the last of Clara's voice. Yet the story, like the girl herself, resisted closure. What emerged next were the secrets behind the diary, pieces that had been overlooked for years, waiting patiently to be found. It began with the margins. Clara's brother noticed it first, tiny symbols drawn at the corners of certain pages, almost invisible unless the light hit just right. At first they looked like doodles, a star, a triangle, a spiral. But when placed together, they seemed deliberate, recurring at intervals too consistent to be accidental. It was as if Clara had been leaving a code for someone who might one day look closely enough. In some places, the symbols were paired with faint indentations, marks left by the pressure of a pen without ink, as if she had written and then torn the page away. What had those missing words said? Who had taken them out? Then came the discovery in the back cover, a folded slip of paper, tucked so deeply into the seam it had almost fused with the leather itself. On it was a single line, written hastily: "If anyone finds this, don't trust the story you've been told." The handwriting was Clara's, unmistakable. The message was chilling. For decades, her disappearance had been framed by official reports, by whispers in town, by the fiancé's grief. But Clara herself seemed to suggest that none of it was the full truth. The diary was no longer just a record of her private fears, it was a map pointing toward a hidden narrative. With this revelation came the painful re-examination of old artifacts. A neighbor recalled that in the weeks before her wedding, Clara had been seen walking alone at night, pacing the street in her nightgown as though sleepwalking. A childhood friend remembered that Clara had once confided she kept hearing noises in her room at night, scratches against the window, whispers beneath the floorboards. At the time, it was dismissed as imagination. But paired with the cryptic entries, the fragments took on a new weight. The police files, long stored away, were revisited too. In one report, never widely publicized, there was mention of a note found in Clara's room after her disappearance. It had been written in her hand, but unsigned, containing only the phrase, "I can't keep quiet anymore." Investigators had considered it a possible runaway note, though it did not fit neatly with the rest of the evidence. Now, against the backdrop of the diary, it seemed less like a farewell and more like the beginning of something she had tried to confess but never managed to complete. And then there was the attic again. Clara's brother, unable to leave the space alone, returned weeks later, combing through boxes with the diligence of someone searching for breath in smoke. Beneath an old trunk, wedged between beams, he found another object, a cassette tape, unlabeled, its magnetic strip slightly warped from heat and age. When played, the tape carried mostly static, but in the haze of sound was a faint voice. Female. Uneven. A few words were audible, broken by distortion: "I'm afraid," and later, "Don't tell." The voice was faint enough to be doubted, but to those who had known her, it was Clara. The recording was never mentioned in police files. Had it been overlooked? Or had it been hidden deliberately? The family wrestled with what to believe. Each discovery was both gift and curse. The more Clara seemed to speak, the less certain her story became. Was she afraid of her fiancé, as some suspected? Was she burdened by family secrets? Was there someone else in the shadows, someone who had watched her since youth, as her entry suggested? The diary, the symbols, the torn pages, the hidden note, the cassette, all of it pointed to truths that were tantalizing yet incomplete, like puzzle pieces belonging to different boxes. For Michael, the fiancé, these fragments were unbearable. Every new revelation cast him again into suspicion. Don't trust the story you've been told. What did that mean? Whose story? His? Her parents? The town's? He insisted that if Clara had been trying to confess something, it wasn't about him, that she had been reaching toward a secret no one else had dared to face. Yet the doubt lingered, unshakable. The community, too, felt the tremors of these discoveries. Rumors reignited. Old theories resurfaced. Some spoke of family tensions, unacknowledged pressures, generational wounds. Others whispered about men in town who had always seemed too interested in young girls, names spoken in hushed tones but never written down. The resurfaced evidence made the absence of answers even sharper, because it suggested there were answers, somewhere, buried beneath silence and time. The haunting truth of Section 9 was this: Clara had not left behind a neat confession. She had left breadcrumbs, fragments, a trail of cryptic whispers scattered across years. Each discovery deepened the mystery instead of resolving it. She was both present and absent, both speaking and silent, both bride and ghost. And the more the family searched, the more it seemed that Clara herself had anticipated this, that she had written, doodled, and hidden things not to explain her disappearance, but to ensure that no one would ever stop asking questions. The diary had begun as a girl's confidant. By the end, it had transformed into a labyrinth. And those who loved her most now wandered inside it, searching for an exit that may not exist. The story ends the way all disappearances do, not with answers, but with echoes. Clara remains, not as a body found in a field or a name attached to a police file, but as a presence that refuses to release the people who loved her. 30 years later, she is both everywhere and nowhere, her absence stitched into the fabric of their lives like a seam that will never close. To speak of Clara now is to feel the tension between memory and mystery, between love and suspicion, between truth and the unknowable. The family still gathers sometimes, though the house on Willow Street has long since been sold. When they meet, the diary is brought out like a sacred text. Its leather has grown more fragile with handling, its pages more worn, but her words still speak with the same strange immediacy. Someone will read an entry aloud, and for a moment Clara is back in the room, the rhythm of her handwriting echoing like footsteps in a hallway. Yet the diary never answers the question that matters most: why did she vanish? Instead, it reminds them of the complexity of the girl they lost, a girl who was never as simple as the wedding dress she never wore. Michael lives quietly now, in a rented house at the edge of another town. He has gray in his hair, lines around his eyes, but his grief has not softened with time, it has only deepened, hardening into something permanent. Sometimes he takes long walks by the water, imagining the life he almost lived: anniversaries, children, arguments over bills, laughter echoing through kitchens. Instead, he carries the silence of a ceremony that never happened, vows that were never spoken. People sometimes ask him if he believes Clara is alive. His answer is always the same: I don't know. But she is still with me. The community has woven Clara into its folklore. Teenagers whisper her name on autumn nights, daring one another to walk past the church where the wedding was supposed to take place. Neighbors still point out the house on Willow Street as though it is haunted, not by ghosts, but by the weight of memory. To some, Clara is a cautionary tale about young brides and secrets unspoken. To others, she is a symbol of something larger, the way small towns bury what they do not wish to face, the way silence becomes its own form of violence. The police files remain unsolved, boxed in archives that smell of paper and dust. Each time someone revisits them, the same frustration returns. There is no resolution, no smoking gun, no neat explanation. Clara is frozen in the space between theories. Was she running from someone? Was she trying to escape? Did she stumble into danger, or did danger find her? The diary complicates these questions rather than clarifying them, leaving investigators, professional and amateur alike, wandering through her words like travelers lost in a fog. And yet, maybe the point was never to solve her story. Maybe Clara, in leaving her fragments, her coded symbols, her unfinished sentences, was reminding the world of something true: that human lives are not puzzles to be neatly completed, but constellations of contradictions. She was both a girl who dreamed of the ocean and a woman who feared the future. She was both in love and afraid of being trapped. She was both present and slipping away, even before the morning she vanished. The tragedy of Clara is not only that she disappeared, but that no one fully saw her while she was still here. On quiet nights, her brother sometimes dreams of the attic. He climbs the ladder, feels the dust against his skin, lifts the box again as though for the first time. In the dream, the diary is still there, but when he opens it, the pages are no longer filled with half